All right. So having begun, having prayed, I pray um, that y'all have prayed one for another, and you've lifted each other's prayer requests up before each other, uh, and that you have that confidence with each other that you can call upon a friend to pray with you in your time of need. We're going through week nine's quiz, so if you will go ahead and pass them to your right, we'll go ahead and grade those. All right, so we're going to list all the kings of Judah in their order, beginning with Rehoboam, Abijam, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram. It's okay if they do not have these spelled correctly. Ahaziah, Athaliah, Joash, Amaziah, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, wicked King Manasseh. That's not his name, but that's what he was. Amon, Josiah, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah. So which king was given the additional 15 years of life? You know that king as King Hezekiah. And which king was the last godly king? That was King Josiah. So go ahead and grade those and then pass them back and put them back into your envelope. Let's go ahead. We don't have much time. We're going to go ahead and jump into the time of the divided kingdom. We're going to skip on past Rehoboam's time, and we're jumping right in to where 2 Kings is. The book begins with the reign of King Ahaziah of Israel, and it concludes with King Zedekiah of Judah. The time span is approximately 250 years, but the way this begins is with the northern kingdom, and its prophet, its minister, was that of Elijah. And so Elijah is considered the greatest of those prophets, and he ministered during the time of wicked King Ahab's rule. Ahab had sought to kill him, and if you recall, there's some he goes and he hides himself at a ravine, and there God sustains him. But when the ravine dries up, he has him go to a widow's house, and there he causes the oil to continue to flow, and that basically provides the food that they need to continue and live in that famine and that during that time. And then finally, God tells them the time for the famine is over. I'm about to send a rain. And he says, basically, go and present yourself to King Ahab. And he does. And when he does, he has a showdown with the prophets of Baal, if you recall. They get up there on top of that mountain, and and Elijah's speech is just so good. He says, how long will you be between two decisions? If God be God, serve him. If Baal be God, serve him. And he says, this is the test that we will put to it, though. The God that answers by fire, he alone is God. And so you know that he allows the prophets of Baal to go first, because he says, I'm just one man. I've got to prepare the sacrifice and prepare the altar and do all this. But they had many, and so they were ready to go real quickly. So he gives them the first swing, and you know they call on Baal to answer by fire, but there's just silence from heaven. And if you recall, Elijah even starts mocking him a little bit. Says, hey, maybe he's on a long journey, or maybe he's sleeping, and you got to wake him up, you know. And so that caused a frenzy with them, and they cried out all the more. And they got to the point where they began to cut themselves. I want to speak to that for just a moment. We live in a day where our teenagers and youth, this has gone on for a long time. There's nothing new under the sun with this. That they are mutilating themselves and cutting themselves, and this, I believe, is demonic in its very nature. And I think it has its beginnings with, or at least some of its beginnings here, with the worship of Baal. And so I believe that the cutting and mutilation of one's body is demonic in its nature. It's to mar the image of God, in essence, because you are made in the image of God, and if you go about marring that image, I believe you are rebelling against the Lord in that thing. All right, so we know what happens next is then Elijah sends for water in the middle of a drought, and he saturates that altar, and he has it uh, he has them put water on it, and he calls down fire from heaven. And not only did the sacrifice get burned, but it licked up the water too. And so the people there saw and believed and worshiped there. And there, Elijah kills all the prophets of Baal, which wasn't probably very difficult. You say, "Wow, he must have been a great warrior." Listen, they were probably so drained from having mutilated themselves by spilling their own blood, they probably didn't have enough strength to fight anyways. And so he kills the prophets of Baal. He tells Ahab he needs to hurry up and get home because God's called for a rain. He goes and he prays and he sends that servant 7 times to go check the horizon to see for rain. And on the 7th time he sees a cloud the size of he says like a fist, and he says it's time. Let's go. And so he goes and he runs. He sprints down the mountain, and he actually outruns King Ahab. And the rain overtakes them, of all things. And it's not too long after this, the next day, that wicked Queen Jezebel says he will be like those prophets by this time tomorrow. She threatened to kill him, and he goes and spirals into a state of depression. Now, I want to speak about depression just really quickly. Elijah just ran a marathon. Okay, quite literally. He sprinted a marathon. He was physically tired. He was spiritually drawn out. He had just seen a great victory that God had brought about, and he then became discouraged within himself. But here's what we see, and God's dealing with Elijah and his depression. I think a lot of those things can still hold true today. I do believe that God has given us medicine to help hit the reset button on our depression, but I don't believe it to be something that should be considered permanent. I think that God gives us spiritual means, physical means to overcome depression. And so what we see here is that God, in dealing with him on this, he uses a very physical way in helping him. Okay, he's physically tired. What does he do? He has him he goes to sleep right beside that tree, remember? And an angel brings him something to eat twice. He's physically tired and he needs to rest. Okay, so many people's depression is, though greatly spiritual, may be greatly practical, and its healing is that they just need to rest. Okay, he goes and fasts for 40 days, and he goes to the mountain of God, and there God speaks to him, not by the fire. Remember, there was a great earthquake, there was a great fire, and God's voice was not in any of those things, but there was that still small voice. And there he speaks with Elijah, and Elijah says, God asks him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he says, "You're asking me why I'm here? They have killed all of your prophets. I'm the only one that's left, and now they seek to kill me." And God there just kindly reminds him, "Look, I've got people that have not bowed the knee to Baal, and I've reserved them for myself. You are not alone." And isn't it true that when we get depressed, we feel like we're alone? And I think that that's good to get around people that kind of help you reinforce that you're not alone. Okay, because loneliness can feed the depression further. And so God ministers to him there, and then he has them go anoint a king and a prophet. Now the prophet is most notable. Is that it's Elisha. We're going to look at his ministry. Whenever Elijah comes to Elisha there in the field while he's plowing with those 12 yoke of oxen, or however many it was, he has he anoints him as the prophet, and then he walks off. And Elisha says, "Let me go bid farewell to my family back home." And Elijah says, "What have I done to you?" And so he, right there, it doesn't seem to record that he goes back home, but right there he does something very significant. He takes the plow, he takes the instruments, and he basically burns them, and he offers a sacrifice to the Lord with that team of oxen that he was just pulling with. the significant thing about that is this: God had called him to be a prophet, not a farmer, and he had to do away with that old life unless he be tempted and return to it. I believe that this was the same thing that Jesus referred to whenever there was that man that came that wanted to follow. Jesus says, "Come, follow me." He says, "Well, let me go bid farewell to my family back home." And he says, "He that puts his hand to the plow, looking back, is not fit for the kingdom." I believe that is a reference to this, because he wasn't going to put his hand to the plow anymore. He wasn't going to look back. He was going to go exactly where God would have him to go. And I think that's a good example for us today. If there's something today that would hinder your ministry, what God would have you do today, you need to do away with it, and do away with it quickly. He had significant. We see Elisha. He ministers in a time where there's a worsening condition, spiritual and moral decay, and he has significant influence with the sons of the prophets, a group that he trained to serve the Lord in the northern kingdom. Here's something interesting. He performed 2 times the miracles of Elijah. Remember, before Elijah was taken up, he asked for a double portion of his spirit to be put upon him. And he says, "Well, if you see me go up, then you know that petition's been answered." And he sees him go up in that chariot of fire up into that whirlwind. And we see that because of that, he performs twice the miracles that Elisha does. He was known and respected beyond the borders of Israel. In fact, you remember Naaman, the Syrian, had leprosy, and there was a woman who was a Jew who was a servant to him, and had passed along word that there was a prophet that could possibly minister to him. And you recall, he goes down there, and he doesn't even come out himself, and he's offended. Remember, and how many times I've seen this with pastors is that he didn't shake my hand. Oh, the outrage! And it's like, but he just gave you the word of God. He gave you what you needed to do, and you're upset that he didn't come out and meet you personally because you're so important. And that's exactly what the Syrian here did. But again, the person, he tells him to go dip 7 times into the Jordan, and he eventually is persuaded to go and do that. And when he comes back out the 7th time, his skin is like a baby skin, and the leprosy is taken away. He has this. There's at one point in time where the Syrians were coming and fighting against Israel during that time, and you recall that they at one point they find Elisha, because they had been told that Elisha is basically informing the king of Israel of the things that are going on. He's not a spy. It's just the Lord is revealing, hey, there's going to be an ambush here. Hey, there's going to be a trap here. Hey, they're going to come over here. And he makes them aware of that. And the Syrians begin to understand that it was Elisha behind this. And so they go and they surround him. And you recall his servant is there. And he says, we're surrounded. We're going to die. And he says, they're more on our side than on his. And there's a great prayer there. And I encourage you to look it up. He asked the Lord to open the eyes of his servant to see the unseen world around him. And I think that's a good prayer for us when we look at the friends, family, and people, that loved ones that we want to see get saved, to pray that the Lord would open their eyes to see the unseen world around them, and that they might call on the name of the Lord to be saved. I believe that would be in keeping with that spirit of intercession that we should have one for another. He was known, he was respected beyond those borders, and whenever they were surrounded there, he also prays that the same Lord who opened up his eyes to see, that he would close their eyes to be blinded. And so he basically, you can just see that the whole Syrian army has been blinded. And they said, he goes to them and said, who are you looking for? And they tell him, and he says, well, I'll show you the way. And so you can see that the whole army has their hand on everybody's shoulder, and they're taking everybody by the hand and say, all right, everybody, we're going to move together. We know where we're going. And so he takes them to the king of Israel, where the king of Israel has the whole army surrounded. And again, Elisha has the king feed them and send them away. And again, showing again that God's victory God's power and victory in Elisha's life. The army came back the next time. The Syrian army came back the next time during a severe famine. And this is where the 4 leprous men went out and said, "Hey, we have nothing to lose. If if we stay here, we're going to die from the famine. So what we'll do is we'll go to the Syrian army and ask for mercy. And if they give us mercy, great. If not, well, we were going to die anyway." So they get out there and they find that the camp has been abandoned. And what happened was the Syrians thought that Israel had hired the Egyptians to come and to fight for them. And they hear a great sound, and they flee because they think the Egyptians are coming upon them, and they leave everything behind, and that's where God also provides for that city, that nation, that victory. Again, there's a lot of sins. There's a lot of things here, guys, that I'm not going to be able to hit on. That you're just going to. I mean, the depth and the richness of this is just so vast that we couldn't. If we had months of time, we wouldn't exhaust the information that's in here. So, forgive me if I kind of go fast. He anoints Jehu. That's the king of Israel that Elisha has anointed. But he doesn't do it himself. He sends a servant because he's well known, remember? And so he sends the servant and is instructed to destroy all of the family of King Ahab and avenge the slain prophets. Now, this also include the king of Judah at the time, because as you recall, Jehoshaphat has an alliance with Israel at that time, at the same time of wicked King Ahab, and he has his son marry one of the daughters of wicked King Ahab, which was Athaliah, and her son was king, and he goes to minister to the king of Israel, who was wounded in battle, and that's when that's when both of them meet Jehu. Jehu annihilated the whole house of Ahab. He also eradicated Baal out of Israel. And because of this obedience, the Lord prospered his dynasty for 4 generations. So let's look at, for a moment, we're going to look at the history of Israel and Judah. Israel, all the remaining 9 kings were evil. Of the remaining 9, Jeroboam II was the 4th king after Jehu. He was also the longest reign as well. That would have been also during the time of Jonah and the rise of the Assyrian Empire. Israel was about to go into captivity, if you recall. During his reign, there were these 3 prophets, Amos, Hosea, and Jonah. Then finally, in 721 BC, in the reign of Hoshea, the Lord brought the Assyrians down on Israel. God tolerated an unrepentant Israel for 200 years. All right, so then we move into what would be considered the single kingdom era, but because if you read Kings and Chronicles, you see that it'll go back and forth. It'll go and speak about the king of Judah for a minute, and they'll speak about the king of Israel, and then they kind of have corresponding timelines. So now that we finished up Israel, let's look at the kings of Judah. God preserves Israel from that same Syrian invasion. If you recall, that was where Sennacherib came, and he pronounced all these evil things against God and against his people, that they shouldn't listen to King Hezekiah. And Isaiah is ministering during that time and tells them there's not going to be an arrow shot against this city. And if you recall, the death angel came and wiped out a huge portion of the Assyrian army. So let's talk about King Hezekiah. He was considered the most righteous of all the kings. He removed idolatry from the nation completely. If you've ever looked at it, it's in it says that he did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord. But there was no but with Hezekiah. He was the most righteous of all of them. He even destroyed. Have you ever heard of the white elephant? You know, the white elephant in the room is that sacred thing that takes away from what you ought to be paying attention to. Did you know that they were worshiping the brazen serpent that Moses had lifted up in the wilderness? And because of its healing properties, of how the people that were bitten by that serpent. It's funny how that we take the things of God and we idolize what was an instrument instead of the person who brought the healing. And so he has even that destroyed. And there are sacred cows in churches too. Things that you're not to touch or destroy or take away. And they hinder the Lord's work many times, and this is exactly in the case here. God delivers him from the Assyrians. He gives him 15 more years of life. Here's the thing about that, though. In the 15 years that God gave him, wicked King Manasseh was born in those 15 years. That's something to think about. I don't have a good theological statement on that, but it's interesting because it's because of the sin of wicked King Manasseh that caused caused Judah to sin. It because of that wicked king, it was now no longer you may go into captivity. You are now going to go into captivity. It's a wrested issue. And so let's look at King Manasseh. He was by far the most wicked. Isn't it funny how the pendulum, it may swing one way, and you have the greatest king. You have a godly king. And then the pendulum, it swings right back the other way, and now you have the worst king. He even offered his own son sacrifice for Molech. During his reign, God had pronounced that the judgment would be irreversible. But here's the beautiful thing about it. He reigned more than longer than any king. 52 years he reigned. And there, while he was in an Assyrian jail, you know what? He found the Lord. And there he turns to the Lord for forgiveness, and the Lord there, he finds mercy and forgiveness. And I think that's a comfort to us. How the long suffering of God, but it doesn't matter how wicked you are. It doesn't matter what bad things you've done. The Lord stands ready to forgive all those who call upon his name. And that heart of contrition and being convinced of their sin, he had become convinced of his sin and seen that the state that he was in, that pit that he was in, he had dug himself. And now he is asking, Lord, take me out of this pit. Set my feet upon a rock. Establish my goings. Put a new song in my heart. And that's what King Manasseh did. But see, what the bad thing was is that he had lived an ungodly life. And then when he went back he was allowed to come back home and rule Judah. No one took him seriously. No one took him seriously because of the wicked life that he had lived before. So this brings us to King Josiah, who is the last godly king to rule. He brought a revival to the nation on a scale that had never been seen before. And after the dark days of King Manasseh, Josiah orders the temple to be rebuilt or to be refurnished and refurbished. The Passover there is reinstituted. It had been neglected for the 50 some odd years of King Manasseh's reign. And there they find that scroll, the law, and it was read in Josiah's ears, and there he rents his clothing. Remember, in humble contrition, he says, we've broken all these laws. We have broken the covenant of our Lord. And he has it read into the ears of the people. And they too, with one heart and one consent, give themselves over to the Lord. And and they keep the Passover. And many of them were still unclean, that there wasn't enough time to keep the Passover and the priests to be clean and the people to be cleansed. And so he asked the Lord to forgive them of this insurrection so that they might be obedient in keeping of this Passover. But after Josiah's death, we have a really quick succession into the latter kings that brought the children of Judah into captivity. This happened in less than 25 years of Josiah's death. The southern kingdom would be taken. And in 605 BC, the Battle of Carchemish, this is where Babylon defeated the combined Assyrian and Egyptian forces. You have the old power of the Egyptians, you had the current of the Assyrians, and then you had the coming of the Babylonian Empire, and they were all defeated at Carchemish and emerged as the world superpower. In 605 BC, Judah under Jehoiakim became subject to paying annual taxes. In 597 BC, Jehoiakim refused to pay those taxes, and Nebuchadnezzar came and took the temple treasure and 10,000 captives and are taken to Babylon. 586 BC, Zedekiah withheld those taxes. Nebuchadnezzar returns to destroy the city and carry the remaining into captivity. And so, with that, we're going to look at 1st and 2nd Chronicles, because after that, they are taken into captivity. That's how Kings ends, is the captivity of Jerusalem being carried captive, and all of the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, of those that were still left behind of the southern kingdom. 1st and 2nd Chronicles. These books are complementary to 1st and 2nd Kings. It was written to remind the people in Babylon captivity that the Lord was still with them, that He would restore them to the land. 1st and 2nd Kings is written by Jeremiah. 1st and 2nd Chronicles is written by Ezra. And the reason for that, it gives you two perspectives. Jeremiah is writing it to tell them why they're going into captivity. And Ezra is writing it to remind them why they're being restored back from exile. And he is reminding them of the promises and the things that the Lord had done in the past. That's why it was so important, because the genealogies take up chapters 1 through 9. Why was that? Because their families had all gone off into captivity, and they were going to make sure that the lineage was pure, and that it had not been defiled. And so the Babylonian captivity, it lasted 70 years, from 605 BC to 536 BC. This was for failing to let the land rest every 7th year. And so for the 490 years that they were in the land, God brought upon their head the years of rest that should have occurred. And so for 70 years, they are going into captivity. Now here's the crux of it all. That was the reason for the length of their captivity. That's why they were also very meticulous in keeping the Sabbath, especially during Jesus' time, because they feared because that commandment was for how long because that command was broken, was for how long they were going into captivity. If they were to keep that commandment, the Lord wouldn't let them go into captivity. And that wasn't the case at all. Yes, that was for why then, but they had made the keeping of the Sabbath to the exclusion of keeping of the other commandments as well. And they too in 70 AD were also judged as well, but also because they had rejected their Messiah. All right, so this emphasized only the southern kingdom, obviously, because Ezra is not speaking for the children of Israel of the northern kingdom that was part of the Assyrian captivity that eventually came back, and they became known as the Samaritans. He is specifically honing in on the southern kingdom. He is also reminding them of the temple. Why? Because the temple needed to be rebuilt. He reminded them of the godly kings, while giving little room for the wicked kings. It spoke of a sacred history. It spoke of the priests. The wars were less prominent, and it was an encouragement to the remnant. The Jews that were in Babylon, this encompasses the ministry of Ezekiel, Daniel, and Ezra, and the records records the history of the Jews in Babylon. The Jews left in Palestine. This was whenever the captivity occurred with King Nebuchadnezzar, And Jeremiah had been telling them captivity, captivity, captivity. And now Jeremiah is left with that remnant there in Palestine after Jerusalem is destroyed. And Mizpah, this is important. Mizpah becomes the political center, and Gedaliah was selected by Nebuchadnezzar to govern the area. So Gedaliah was selected by Nebuchadnezzar to govern the area, but he was assassinated by Ishmael, and the people rose up and had Ishmael, or had rose up and fought against Ishmael. They were delivered from Ishmael and asked Jeremiah. They asked Jeremiah to inquire of the Lord of what they needed to do, because they feared that the king of Babylon would come back down and just completely wipe out everything living, because his appointed regent had been killed, and so they were very, very conscious of this. But they were saying at the same time, "But we want to hear from the Lord." And the Lord didn't respond right away with Jeremiah, and he actually takes a week of praying for direction. But he says, "You've already made up your mind. Why do I need to tell you what the Lord wants you to do? The Lord wants you to stay here, and here He will rebuild you and make you a people here, and not completely utter destroyed. But if you go into Egypt, which your hearts have already made up your mind, that's where you're going to go. Then famine will follow you there. War is going to follow you there." And we know that because later Babylon goes down into Egypt and just completely destruction found them, just like it did in Jerusalem. And so Jeremiah goes along with them as well, because they flee from the Babylonians, but again, only to run right back into them again. And with that, this concludes the time of that divided kingdom, and even into the single kingdom. So with that, you have a quiz for next week. Let's go ahead, and I'm gonna tell you what's on the quiz before we dismiss. Who did Nebuchadnezzar leave in charge of the Palestinian area? And we just went over that. So if you have your notes, that's going to be for next week's quiz. Who assassinated him? Who was it that assassinated him? Where did the remaining people of Israel flee? And what prophet did they take with them? So if you were paying attention in the last 5 minutes, these are pretty easy to answer and come to a conclusion to. So with that, we'll see you again next week. Guys, we're on the home stretch, and I want you to be mindful of that you don't neglect your studies in this. The quizzes are going to be much easier from this point forward, because in light of your final, you're going to need to be ready for that. And here in about a week or two, I'm going to go ahead and give you what's going to be on your final, so you can be studying and you can be ready for that final. But again, you need to keep up with your quizzes, because it's the only way that I can keep, with me being absent and having to do this by video, it's the only way I can keep up with attendance, but also to give you a weighted grade as well. So please, please, please keep up with those. And if you lose them, talk to Dr. Jerry, talk to someone there at the school, and you can retake the quiz. But I need you to if you retake the quiz, I need you to put on the top of it that it was a quiz that's been retaken. And we will actually have a class. I think it's going to be the week before your final. You're going to have an entire class, most of an entire class, that if you have any missing quizzes, if you have any even if you missed your midterm, you might be able to also take it there. But here's the thing: don't take advantage of this. Like if you did bad on the midterm, or you did bad on a quiz, you cannot retake it. Okay, I need there to be a little bit of honesty amongst you in this. This is only for those who couldn't be there, that they will also be able to make it up. Now, whenever you make up these quizzes, you need to put in parentheses and brackets, makeup. The reason for that is because you will get points for the answers, However, you will not be able to get points for your attendance. And I know that, but that's just such a small amount of your grade. So don't get all worked up. It's like, oh, I couldn't help that, or I understand. I completely get it, but it's just to help me with recording things. So if you could help me on that front, that'd be great. And with that, we'll see you next week.